I just want to pick up, Gagan, on the point Navdeep made on the inequality. There is this whole discussion that the fact that India has been able to get about 100 million people out of poverty. So basically, the GDP growth is the answer. Where everybody will rise with the GDP growth. And the way to achieve something of that kind, and then the challenge of inequalities, which is also growing, and the way to deal with that are two different subjects at this point of time. So I have heard in some forums that the first focus should be to get people out of poverty rather than being bothered and concerned about inequality, because the approach is to deal with this too, because you are engaged with the whole public policy discourse. How do you look at this kind of a two kinds of perspectives?
No, I find it a completely vacuous argument. And the reason is not that there's anything, it's a great thing to get people out of poverty, right? It's about the measures of poverty that you have, right? Can we seriously say that with the kind of economic profits and growth that we have, that it makes sense to say that getting 100 million people out of poverty, above the poverty line, is a sufficiently good objective sign of success, or dealing with something as significant as the kind of abject starvation and hunger that we have in this country. If you look at the sheer skew in the distribution of that growth, then I think we can say that we have a serious problem with these figures. And a lot of the data is missing. A lot of the data is constructed on grounds that show that's performative in nature. As far as we can tell, when environmental quality worsens, when in the context of the climate crisis, people who bear the brunt, are these captured in this poverty reduction data? I don't think so. And I think there's a tangible move not to look at certain other things except basic consumption of calorific value, which is how the poverty line is seen. And that's, at this point, I think it's kind of trivial to say that.
So Navdeep, let's enter another space. And, you're a civil society watcher. You're on boards. You're an advisor. And if we truly want to be civil society, what would be the foundational principles which you think should, in a sense, be the defining principles of who is civil society? When they do what, that they can be considered civil society?
And this goes back to the foundation of the idea of civil society, the space where citizens continue to promote values of democracy, of cohesion, of various sorts of things that keep a society healthy, and also that of inclusion. So basically justice, ideas of justice, if they are not undergirding all the work that organizations do, if egalitarianism, if looking clearly at processes that are where redistribution is happening in a very skewed way, if these are not sort of foundational, then it'll be hard for this idea of civil society to really serve what it was envisaged as.
I call it a tripod of service delivery where nobody reaches, innovation, and protest based on if things are not happening, based on the values, as a tripod on which civil society raised. The shift now is more toward delivery of services, and less on asking the good questions. And how do you think this can be good, for example, good research, or what would be the way that civic space can, civil society can recapture the space?
Just to add now, because you use the word citizenship, even yesterday we had this little bit of a contestation. especially in the era where citizenship definitions are linked to the nationalism. The recent happenings in US, the executive orders, some of the happenings that we have experienced in this country. When we look at the civil society or civil space, is the citizenship a more restrictive concept, or do we use it more in terms of a performatory, or just as a kind of a tag, or should it be more persons who reside maybe in a particular geography, which is very different than defined by a citizenship kind of a constraint because of this link with the nationalism that one is seeing in a very growing fashion in Europe, in the United States, in countries like India, and we can see that also in our neighboring countries now happening in a much bigger fashion. So just also clarify, I think, building from Gagan, if you can clarify this piece also.
No, I think I'll start. I think that is a very nice way to put it. Service delivery, I mean, eventually the idea of service delivery by civil society should have taken over time a decreasing role. Because, what are public resources for, if not for delivery of services? Why should there be organizations outside the government when the government is entirely based as a public, custodian of public resources? Where are the resources going? So the questions and the protests that need to come in should be more about not just the infringement of people's rights, but where, what is government actually doing? What is the role of government? And that brings one to the idea that if the role of the government has shifted so dramatically to move away from public services, public service delivery, and align itself with other large resource holders, where the nature of the state itself has changed, where it's extremely coercive now to people asking questions or to people engaging in protests, then what room can you have for what the kind of civil society you're talking about that is founded on issues, that is founded on goals of justice, goals of empowerment, not in terms of citizenship, but in terms of humans, in terms of human society as a flourishing, healthy human society. Citizenship, of course, is very restrictive because now it's defined entirely by state jurisdiction, and for some reason now states' jurisdictions have become less, have become less. I don't know how to put this, but it's becoming a question again, who is a citizen, right? And should we start these exercises of documenting who is a citizen? And that cuts along the idea of religion and different kinds of identities, and what kind of nationalisms are there that exist, what kind of nationalist projects are taking place in different countries. We know that what's happening in the US is a nationalist project, what's happening in India, what's happening in several other countries. These are redefining the norms of citizenship all over again. So one wonders, in this context, is it worth talking about civil society in terms of these three prongs, or is it possibly that we revisit what kind of spaces there are where these things are actually happening, where these, and if you look at universities, institutions, as you talked about, as research, what's happening there? Are they moving away from, if all these institutions were designed to serve the public, are they still doing that, or are they doing something else? Who's redefining? What kind of dominating discourses are emerging that are creating space for different sorts of goals to be met? Nationalist goals, particularistic nationalist goals, let me put it that way, than universal ones, or something else. So that's, for me, those are the questions about civil society and these things that you've laid out.
And it's global, or do you see some spaces where it is flourishing and other spaces where it is declining? What's your overarching sense of what's going on?
I think it's hard to say much from a distance, but I think over the last couple of years, several countries, several places have erupted in protests around the genocide in Gaza, and that has the variation in the ways in which they've been dealt with, whether they have been privileged in the sense that where civic authorities, governments, municipal bodies have passed resolutions to have a ceasefire, to police police acting against people who are demonstrating or who are, so that whole variation tells us what kind of room there is worldwide. Several countries as national governments have come in favor of a ceasefire. That tells you what kind of a civic culture those countries have, what kind of values they have institutionalized. And for me, it's a very good radar of a country to say that we promote values of justice, we promote equality, we promote all these things. This is what our stance is on a ceasefire. And countries who otherwise have democratic governments, elected governments and things like this, and they either have no view on a genocide, or they have no view on a ceasefire, or they have no view on something else, or they say that we are fine with whatever is going on. So we must look at certain barometers of how these judgments are made.
Yeah. But how do you see this extreme form in our neighboring countries too? Bangladesh, Sri Lanka. Is it you would call civic action, or you would see it in some other way, or you'd see it politically motivated, etc.? I mean, for me, it's a mystery how it happened.
I don't have enough information to make value judgments on what's happening there. If it's some kind of a uprising, if it's some kind of a mass mobilization, then it's very hard to say that that's not a civic kind of a civic movement. Whether it's civil or not, whether you want to say that any kind of violence means, or any kind of demonstration means that it's not civil, that's a kind of a different thing. But one thing is very clear, that countries living with authoritarian governments, any kind of civic action which is met with severe violence, that's the nature of how people organize in civic terms. We may not like, I'm saying that there are times when I may not like something that is extremely violent, but maybe that it's a result of authoritarian governments.
But I think both of us would be very clearly believing that non-violence and civil society is a core value. How does one justify, therefore, a very violent, otherwise mechanism, and people not getting violent? This, I'm quite foxed. I don't know. I'll say, yeah, violence is bad. But on the other hand, there is violence being, thrown on them day in and day out. Structural violence, economic violence. But when it comes to physical violence, we put our hands up. I'm foxed by it. I would never advocate for physical violence. But how do I justify? Is there some thoughts you have done on that? And how do you handle this polarity?
I have no way, again, of justifying that kind of violence, whether it's against authoritarian state or within. These are complicated sort of things. I can't possibly think of figuring out. On the other hand, one can analyzing and critically examining these movements, one can see the possibility that states that otherwise practice violence in different forms, those forms of violence can be visibilized by, if we look at these sorts of violent movements as outcomes of people's sort of thresholds being reached, where they can no longer,
tolerate, no longer can sustain their non-violent.
I wouldn't justify any of these either way, but on the other hand, it tells us that violent movements that are violent don't erupt from nowhere. Violence is something that people are start out making demands with. There are so many ways of making demand. There are so many ways of, people where writing is banned, where poetry is banned, where art is banned, where public anything that
Cartoons
people can do
banned.
then I think that's a very good way to understand why there will be social violence in a space like this eventually. But much of that violence comes from states and state machineries in the first instance.
And how do corporates look at this kind of violence? Do they're so desanitized about it, or they're concerned?
I think right.
I'm coming from there.
Right.
In a positive way.
I think, from whatever I've understood so far about the way in which international business, MNCs function, I don't know about, I don't want to say, is that there is this comparative idea of a comparative host. So places which have more stability, places which have more, places that are peaceful, could possibly be places where they should be able to operate very well. But if you look at the countries where MNCs actually operate, they are not those kinds. So then one wonders, what is the relationship of multinational corporations to the kind of polity in which they operate? And if they are mostly authoritarian, they must be supporting some form of that authoritarianism in the first instance, and it's through coercive power of the state then that they can make profits, that they can run their operations, right? If there are poor working standards and extremely poor standards enforced in Bangladesh, for example, in the garment factories, then it's very clear that corporations have no interest, even if they have the norms, of following it, and that happens. So has happened several times. The idea of sweatshops is not new. For 50 years, people have been writing about sweatshops run by the largest corporations. On paper, they have wonderful supply chain policies. What kind of supply chain they have? No child trafficking, no all sorts of things. None of these things have really gone down. None of these things are, until we have enough reportage on all of these large corporations. So I don't really know. Maybe individuals in these corporations have this, but they also live in enclaves, much like the earlier diplomatic corps, post-colonial diplomatic corps that used to create enclaves for safety of UN officials, the higher-ups, and co-opt people from those countries. MNCs do the same thing. They are also like a diplomatic corps. The folks who work there, the highest echelons, are as wealthy as a global elite, and they have enclaves where they live. They have security. They have all of these things. If they are hiring locally, many of those folks will be subject to the conditions that they are living in. They may have views, but those views are controlled and regulated through their employment.
Not just because we are in this space of looking at the protest contestations, I'm doing a little bit of a change of sequence in terms of how we wanted to proceed this conversation. Because one of the things, because you are also academic, you are working on the academic campus. One is increasingly seeing, and let me also give you my personal example, because I joined in this whole social field post-emergency, participating in the student movement. And there were some strictures, very clear strictures, that no police will be allowed to enter the campuses without the Senate resolution. So you can imagine that is how the standard was, that without the Senate resolution, no police can enter the campus. And you may remember some of the instances of the Mumbai student taking over the University of Mumbai, appointing their own vice chancellor, appointing their own registrar, and holding the university for a day in their own hands. That is no more possible, because now left, right, and center in number of campuses, and it's not the case only in India, it's also the case in US, where any form of protest by students and the academic community on legitimate human rights issues, legitimate global concerns are criminalized, are immediately seen as, in case of US, some of the extremes that they have deportation of students, cancelling the student visas. So you have those kinds of instances where in countries like India, we of course have had a history of last few years where, even the universities were in a way named as universities which produce antisocial elements, kind of a branding. Because you work on the campus, you work with the student community actively, What's your take on this? What's happening? Because earlier it was seen as the campuses were like the sovereign at one level for free thought, free speech, and liberal in that sense, right? What's your take on that?
I mean, as a student in universities, I've had a very different experience than being in the campus, which is a business school. Business school campuses, I mean, I'm not sure of other places, but business school campuses are not ones that are politically particularly active. The kinds of things that are happening out there are of less interest to business students. Business students have generally a very singular kind of an objective of coming here. This is a professional education. This is basically job seeking, and that's the process we have to go through. This is not a place where they look at the wider issues. There is, of course, always some people who come in from social science backgrounds, or somebody who's been active on their own undergraduate campuses where they're concerned about things. So they write petitions, they do certain things. But in general, it's not the standard idea of the university where people would, raise questions of public interest, public value. That does not take place in general in the institutional campuses of the business schools.
So citizenship making happens where? I mean, that's a question I'm sitting with. When does a young person become a citizen? Which space?
Informed, conscious, critically thinking.
It's by accident. Either by lived experience.
Okay.
Either by lived experience, where you bear the brunt of exclusion, of discrimination, of disenfranchisement, or you grow up in an environment that is not like the environment one should be afforded to in a so-called free, democratic, egalitarian country, then that's where you learn citizenship. Or it's by accident in these elite schools where there is some amount of sort of liberal and engaged scholarship, which is on the decline now. People who would do that.
Faculty,
right,
as part of their subject, is it also not that they have to make healthy citizens?
Not in the business school. In the business school, out of 800 or 900 sessions that students do, 10 are devoted to ethics, and that what that entails. They may be very engaged sessions, but they are not central to the curriculum. And also, ethics as a term now is extremely vague.
Yeah.
What does it mean? Is it personal? Is it spiritual? Should we do this? Should we not do this? Should we first, like you said, should we first grow the resources through economic growth and then do something good for other people, charity? Should we not? These are all open questions. It's do what you want. It's up to you. If you want to adopt values of dharma that are given in some thing, or
but
if you want
many of the business school students have moved to becoming great social entrepreneurs. They are by accident or supported by the institution.
So social entrepreneurship is something that is still, whether does it contribute to democratic citizenship? I don't know. It definitely contributes to some intervention in what we are saying is the social, right? Whether it's providing welfare in some way or the other, these are matters of discussion. We can say that there is some value being created and added. But the context of where that's happening is privileging market forces, right? It's privileging the laws and rules of business. And where are those resources coming from? Are they shaking up the society in some way? Are they causing us to reflect on deep inequality, marginalization, or is it causing us to celebrate one venture by someone that is, doing something good, admittedly? But so there's a value in that, and there's definitely space, and it's wonderful to have it. But the kind of questions that we are asking, whether that has any credence, what kind of a stance do social entrepreneurs take up in the context of the kind of violence that we are seeing, in society,
India,
globally or in India? What should it be? Are they private individuals, with some stake in the way in which society is, or not? I mean, these are questions that I think need to be answered before we say that this is one response of business schools.
So broadly, many of those, Gagan, you may disagree with me on that. It's more managerial, many of the social entrepreneurship than deep down with the social values and the kinds of things that we would look for societal change, societal transformation, bringing in, where equal opportunities for people, irrespective of their caste, creed, and religion. Those kinds of things. How much, and do they ever even take stands on any of these issues which are happening around them? Whether they even contest social policies which are promoting any of this. Rather, you will find them on the other side of the fence when any, affirmative action, positive social discrimination actions are proposed. You will find those taking a very different stance. So I would be more aligned to what you're outlining, Navdeep. Yeah, provocative. Okay, yeah.
Disagree with what he's saying or you, but then the questions still remain: who should be investing in citizenship? Yeah. And this becomes a big question. The state is not interested, market is not interested, and educational systems are not interested. Where will the citizens come from?
So the idea, I still say that the lived experience of people is bringing them to this. So even privileged young people, their lived experience, given the kind of access to information that they have, the injustice, inborn sense of justice and injustice that they feel, that they experience, that may not have been worn out yet, that they may not have been conditioned by all the things that. I think from there I see young people from a whole cross section of society seriously questioning it is happening, and I find that some of those people may be marginalized in places like business schools, in places like corporations, but they're there, and not only are they there, they offer solidarity in many different ways, especially when they have access to resources of their own. The kind of solidarity and the kind of questions they're able to raise, the way in which they're able to provide allyship and sort of strengthen and help mobilize groups that are taking charge of their own conditions. I think I see that happen a lot. Yeah, people are trivialized. I feel that young people are quite often trivialized a whole lot because they are seeming from our older generation's perspective to engage in things or speak in ways that are trivial. But I think that's not, that is a misrepresentation of their outlook, their thought, what they're willing to do, how they express themselves, and the possibilities that they can bring to shifting a lot in the political sphere, in the civic sphere.
So now you talk about what you call the discursive and interpretive policy analysis and how that would aid in terms of unpacking the government narratives. So the two questions. One is, of course, I would like you to explain the discursive and interpretive policy analysis in a more simple, plain English for our dear listeners. The questions is how this has brought about change, because Gagan and I were discussing, there was a time when a small news item in a newspaper, even in a district newspaper, would create a hustle and have been seen as a kind of a driver for policy at the state level, whether it is related to hunger deaths or whatever. We have those experiences from 70s and 80s, and we remember them vividly. Now that is not the case. The social policy, as we have been discussing, has become much more interest-driven, much more corporatized, much more top-down kind of a thing. So, how civil society, if at all, can influence social policy, public policy, both, I'm using the two terms separately, and do they have any role at all, or the scope of that is already closed and they shouldn't just waste their time? So that's the first type of a question. So the simple clarification, the first question. And the second question, in terms of the looking at the discursive and prescriptive analysis, how can some of these methodologies be used by civil society actors for creating engagement with the state and the markets? If again there is a scope or not, or what's your take on that?
Simply put, discursive interpretive policy analysis offers a way to critically examine policy making as a process that is imbued with power and values, right? Which normally the so-called conventional approaches to policy analysis don't do that. They accept as given. It's called structural functionalism. That here's a structure, this is its function, this is what it does, and at the most what we find is that there is a gap in what it has done, like an implementation failure or a design failure, and then we go and rectify it. A discursive interpretive policy analysis, there's a lot of philosophy of science that can explain this in a classroom kind of situation, but it allows the examination of the kind of values in which policies are framed, are designed, who they benefit, who they exclude, who they include. This is all that kind of stuff that can be done in a way that doesn't go into some ideological challenge or ideological debate, but it's simply a way of seeing what kind of a society does this policy, or even a small scheme, what kind of a society does it envisage? What does it promote? What kind of values does it promote? It might be delivering nice services to some folks, but is it in doing that, like for example, the Anganwadi service, the digitization of the Anganwadi service, is that actually helping the Anganwadis function better, or is that shifting power to other actors, people who control technology, data? Is it enabling them to be in more control of how public resources are being used? Right? Those are the kind of questions that can come up. Yeah. Why is that helpful to civil society? Because the kind of projects, the kind of work that civil society actors may end up doing may be quite often against their own values and against their own... it's not that people don't know this. I mean, people know this from the ground up. But quite often, if you talk about research and analysis, then this may be a way to separate out and really provide clarification to concepts and categories that can be used to show what kind of values undergird what kind of policies and projects, right? What kind of schemes. And from that perspective, it's very interesting. Why it's useful is that something that may sound very nice on paper may actually be quite detrimental to the community in which a project is unfolding, right? It may be an infringement on their rights. It may be disempowering for them, while using the language of empowerment of some kind and delivering something, transferring resources to them in some way, but probably could be taking away something else. Could also be, let's say that, through this discursive interpretive policy mechanism, you figure out that certain policies and projects, if implemented, are pushing an individualization amongst people, right? It's they are trying to individualize people to such an extent, create norms of competition such that the community will lose out. It will break bonds. It will lose a sense of the collective. It will do many other things in the kind of while talking about achievement, better scores like in school or something or the other, right? So this is a way of unpacking. Right. It's a way of unpacking something that is given that we get, one reads a lot of government announcements about projects. So much money goes. This is a way to unpack that and see it clearly for how is it function. We don't say, okay, we have this, now let's see what we can do with it. Well, the first thing you could do after you've done a critical examination of it through the discursive interpretive policy is to protest it, is to see that there are deep problems with this. It's not what we can do with it, it's what we should be doing in terms of redesigning it, or maybe, something like that. That's the possibility that it offers.
Yeah. In a sense, what would it unleash?
Right.
in terms of power structure? Will it increase inequality? Will it increase exclusion? I remember Watershed. Thousands of crores went into it.
Into watershed development, yes.
And the question then came, what happened to the landless? And they were back to labor, but then you had migrant labor coming. So, and those things were talked of, but is there a method which one can train or, civil society people to do this more, effectively? Is there a method to train people in this? Not the high end, but at the operative level?
The methodology, the pedagogy of doing this is obviously very commonly used as well, mostly in universities because it's research, it's oriented towards research. But coming back to this other thing, that a lot of the researchers who are interested and whose personal values align with justice and various kinds of things adopt these methodologies because they see the world in a different way. And by doing that, their classes, their readings, their engagements are of a kind that also promote these methodologies. And of course, there are pedagogical spaces and methods and tools that can be developed. The theatre workshop is a very common tool or a space in which these methodologies, participatory, critical, discursive, interpretive, can function very well. I mean, I also do a course in the institute, which is a theatre-based methodological sort of a workshop, which is of this kind, which allows this engagement, and without naming from a philosophy of science perspective, does this job.
So, in short, what we're saying is that the discursive and interpretive analysis also, in a way, focuses much more on the process and the outcomes, rather than a lot of the other things where you take things for granted. I've given. It's much more looking at it from the process and the outcomes as a kind of a combination of those. So, in terms of how, like Gagan asked that question, in terms of, you feel that this can be used by social activists, by civil society organizations to counter and create counter narratives, in that sense. Do you see that as a potential for something of this type of a methodology?
Yes, I mean,
beyond academics, of course.
Beyond academics, yes, of course. I mean, in some ways, a lot of the people who we call activists are simply enacting these sorts of methodologies because they challenge, they critique, they confront. So their work, the way in which they develop methodologies of functioning, are reflective of these without the academic overlay.
Putting the tag.
So if I change their identity from activists to discursive researchers, it will give them another way to do the same thing. Yeah, that's very good. I think it's a good thing for civil society to look at a new way of disruption. I think that's a very nice thing. So coming to the end, Navdeep, if now we zoom back in a bigger picture, what therefore, given if you look at the future, and again back to civic space, civil society, market and state, and this interface, which are the spaces where civil society should think of in terms of engaging, influencing, and raising the right question? What would be those 2-3 big issues?
I think one, the job for civil society would be to really struggle and fight on grounds of what is considered public education. Because public education, the idea of education itself is a battleground for what kind of a nation do we have, what kind of values do we promote, what kind of identities do we promote. So if we want a civic culture of democracy, of egalitarianism, education is that kind of place where there is a struggle. As far as markets go, markets have overreached and also failed tremendously, and civil society should have a very clear role that that where this entire space dominated by markets and market-like logics in government should be resisted. I think that's for me. These are the two things that will have some.
A little more zooming out, still global finance, gig work, this kind of thing. In this, is there any space that civil society should be also looking at in a more deeper way?
Or do you see any sliver of hope in any of this kind of a
agenda setting again?
I mean,
climate change.
Right. Well, of course, climate change is definitely the question that all of what we are talking about is in the context of climate collapse. Really, at this point, what we are talking about is the climate is in none of the efforts of greening or sustainability that we have talked about, or the principles that are espoused in organizations, things. So zooming out, I mean, that should be an absolutely principal objective of dealing with the gig work and technology. I mean, if we accept that technology is kind of now on a steamroller and there's nothing to do, finding ways to organize workers and people better wages, more decision-making spaces. If any of these entrepreneurs, these tech entrepreneurs who are starting things, if they don't have workers on their board, then I think that they're extremely regressive. I would say that none of these so-called friendly policies will do the job of instead of having workers very strongly represented the word, bringing back unions and whatever. I know that they're highly politicized in our context and all of these things, but the idea of representation and worker rights, they're being decimated in law. So whether civil society has space to do that, to push for that, to imagine a world in which technology has a place, but not at the expense of the marginalization of people who are actually producing what
empower through the technology.
Right.
This kind of
right.
We also plan to do a special episode on the workers' rights in the changing times and the changing employment scenario. Also, of course, now no more, you can't discuss workers' rights without the technology issues and the AI and the role of the AI in terms of what's the future of work. It's a larger question in terms of what's the future of work kind of thing.
But thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
It's been really a pleasure.
Thank you.
And you've really unmuted.
Thank you very much.
You.
Yeah.
You've really unmuted this episode. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.